For years, the world knew Zahara Jolie for one reason before everything else. She was Angelina Jolie's daughter. She grew up surrounded by cameras, movie stars, and one of the most recognizable families in Hollywood. But then she went to Spelman College, and something happened that most people watching from the outside never saw. Zahara began building a life that had almost nothing to do with Hollywood. She studied psychology. She found a community. She joined a historic sisterhood. She built friendships that had nothing to do with her family's fame. And for 4 years, she became something the cameras rarely showed us. Not a celebrity's daughter. Not a Hollywood child. Just a college student trying to figure out who she wanted to become. Then, in May 2026, Zahara walked across the graduation stage at Spelman. And suddenly, the little girl the world had watched grow up was gone. Standing there was a 21-year-old woman with a degree, a community behind her, and a future that no longer needed to follow the path anyone had imagined for her. But there is one detail that makes her Spelman story even more fascinating. Her journey wasn't about rejecting her famous family. It was about discovering what existed beyond it. Because when you are born into a family this famous, everyone already knows your parents. The real challenge is giving the world a reason to remember you. And perhaps Spelman gave Zahara exactly that opportunity. So what really happened to Zahara Jolie during those 4 years? How did a Hollywood child become a psychology graduate, a member of a powerful sisterhood, and a young woman preparing to define her own future? And why might her graduation be only the beginning of the most interesting chapter of her story? Because Zahara didn't simply go to college. She grew up there, and the woman who walked out of Spelman in 2026 was not the same girl who walked in. When Zahara Jolie chose Spelman College, she wasn't simply choosing a university. She was choosing an environment. For most of her childhood, Zahara had lived inside a world where her family name could attract attention almost anywhere. Angelina Jolie was one of Hollywood's most recognizable actresses. Brad Pitt was one of the world's biggest movie stars. And Zahara had grown up with cameras following a family that millions of people already knew. But Spelman offered something completely different. It was a place where her parents' careers weren't the center of the conversation. A place built around education, history, achievement, and community. And that distinction mattered. Spelman College is a historically black women's college in Atlanta, with a long tradition of educating women who go on to make their mark in fields far beyond entertainment. For Zahara, it meant entering a community where she could be known for what she did, not simply for who her parents were. She chose to study psychology. That decision immediately gave her story another dimension. Instead of following the most obvious Hollywood path, Zahara entered a field focused on people. How they think, how they develop, how experiences shape behavior, how relationships can influence a person's life. And perhaps that was exactly the kind of environment she needed. Because growing up famous doesn't automatically teach you who you are. Sometimes it makes that question harder. When everyone already has an opinion about you, discovering your own identity can take time. College can provide that time. 4 years to learn. 4 years to make mistakes. 4 years to build friendships. 4 years to discover what matters when nobody is asking about your parents. And at Spelman, Zahara found more than a classroom. She found a community. She became part of campus life. She formed friendships. She experienced the kind of everyday moments that don't usually make Hollywood headlines. And slowly, the story began to change. The public had spent years asking about the Jolie Pitt children. But inside Spelman, Zahara was simply a student. She had assignments, classes, friends, goals, and a future she hadn't completely figured out yet. That ordinary experience may have been one of the most extraordinary opportunities she had ever received. Because sometimes, Growing up doesn't mean separating yourself from your family. It means discovering which parts of yourself exist independently of them. And Zahara's time at Spelman was about to reveal exactly that. Because the next chapter was just about what she studied. It was about the person she was becoming. Spelman gave Zahara something Hollywood never could. Time. Time to grow without every decision becoming a headline. Time to make friends without the cameras following. And time to discover what interested her when nobody was asking about Angelina Jolie. She studied psychology, and that choice is worth paying attention to. Psychology is ultimately about people. How they think, how they develop, how experiences shape behavior, how relationships influence the way we see ourselves and the world around us. For Zahara, those questions could hardly have been more relevant. She had grown up in an extraordinary environment. Her childhood was surrounded by fame, travel, cameras, and public attention. But inside Spelman, she could approach those questions as a student rather than as a celebrity. She was there to perform. She was there to learn. And that distinction seems to have shaped her college experience. Instead of building her identity around entertainment, Zahara became part of a campus community. She attended classes. She built friendships. She participated in student life. And she experienced something that is difficult to measure from the outside. A sense of belonging. For someone whose life had been documented by the public, since childhood, ordinary college experiences could have been incredibly valuable. There was no need to make every moment a statement. She could simply be a young woman figuring things out. And perhaps that is where the biggest transformation happened. Not in one dramatic decision. Not in one headline. But gradually, year after year, Zahara was becoming more independent. She was learning how to make decisions without the world immediately interpreting them through her parents. She was building relationships that belonged to her. She was discovering interests that were hers. And she was creating memories that had nothing to do with Hollywood. That doesn't mean her famous family stopped mattering. It didn't. Angelina Jolie remained her mother. Brad Pitt remained her father. The Jolie Pitt name would always be part of her history. But history is not the same thing as destiny. And that may be the most important lesson from Zahara's college years. She didn't need to erase her past to create a future. She simply needed to add something of her own to the story. Her education, her friendships, her experiences, her choices. And then came another step that revealed just how deeply she had connected with the community around her. Zahara didn't just attend Spelman. She became part of one of its most meaningful traditions. And that would lead her into a sisterhood that had existed long before she arrived. Then came a part of Zahara's Spelman journey that revealed just how deeply she had connected with the community around her. Sisterhood. At Spelman, Zahara wasn't only attending classes and working toward a degree. She was becoming part of a tradition much bigger than herself. In 2023, Zahara joined Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, incorporated through the Mu Pi chapter at Spelman. The moment attracted attention because of who she was. But inside the story, her famous family was almost beside the point. Alpha Kappa Alpha was founded in 1908 at Howard University. For generations, its legacy has centered on scholarship, service, leadership, and sisterhood. And now Zahara was stepping into that tradition. She wasn't simply the daughter of Angelina Jolie. She was a Spelman student standing alongside other young women who were building their own futures. That distinction matters because celebrity can make you visible. But belonging is something different. Belonging means people know you beyond the name everyone else recognizes. They know your personality, your work, your sense of humor, your ambitions. And perhaps that is what Zahara found at Spelman. A community where she didn't have to explain herself through her parents. She could simply be Zahara. A student, a friend, a sister, a young woman working toward the same future as the people beside her. And her involvement with Alpha Kappa Alpha gave that experience another layer. She was just observing the culture around her. She was participating in it. She was becoming part of a legacy that existed long before Hollywood knew her name. There was another detail that made her involvement especially interesting. When Zahara introduced herself during that chapter process, she was identified as Zahara Jolie. That name immediately attracted public attention. But the significance goes beyond the headlines. It was a name she was using within a community she had chosen to become part of. And 3 years later, that same name would be heard again. This time on one of the biggest days of her life. Her graduation. Then came the moment that made their entire journey feel real. Graduation. On May 17, 2026, Zahara Jolie stood among her classmates at Spelman College and completed one of the most important chapters of her young life. For the public, it was easy to reduce the moment to another headline about Angelina Jolie's daughter. But that misses the point, because the diploma wasn't Angelina's. It wasn't Brad's. It wasn't Hollywood's. It was Zahara's. For 4 years, she had studied psychology. She had built friendships. She had become part of the Spelman community. She had joined Alpha Kappa Alpha. And now she was standing on a stage with an accomplishment that could not simply be inherited. She had earned it. That is what made the moment so powerful. The world first knew Zahara as a little girl growing up inside one of Hollywood's most famous families. Photographers documented her childhood. Entertainment outlets followed her family. Millions of people knew her parents before they knew anything about her. But graduation offered a different image. Zahara was no longer simply being introduced as someone's daughter. She was a college graduate. And there was another detail that made the moment especially significant. When her name was called, she was introduced as Zahara Jolie. The official commencement program listed her as Zahara Jolie Pitt. That distinction immediately attracted attention. But we should be careful not to assume we know exactly what Zahara personally intended by the difference. What we do know is that the name Zahara Jolie had already appeared publicly during her Alpha Kappa Alpha chapter process in 2023. Now in 2026, that same name was heard again as she crossed the graduation stage. 3 years apart. 2 very different moments. But one name. And behind that name was a woman who had spent 4 years building something that belonged entirely to her. Her education, her experiences, her friendships, her sisterhood, her achievement. Her degree was in psychology, a field centered on understanding people, behavior, development, and relationships. After growing up in a world where almost every part of her life could become public, Zahara had spent 4 years studying the very thing that makes people who they are. And she did it away from the traditional Hollywood path. She didn't need a movie premiere. She didn't need a red carpet. She didn't need a film role. Her biggest milestone came in a graduation gown. That doesn't mean Hollywood disappeared from her life. It never could. Her parents remained 2 of the most recognizable figures in entertainment. Her childhood will always be connected to them. But graduation added something that belonged entirely to Zahara. An accomplishment no one could give her. She had to earn it. And that changes the question we've been asking about her. For years, the question was, what will Angelina Jolie's daughter become? Now there is a better question. What will Zahara become? Because she has reached the point where the answer doesn't have to come from her parents. It can come from her. And perhaps that is the real significance of Spelman. It didn't erase Zahara's past. It gave her 4 years to build on it. And now that chapter is over. Graduation gave Zahara something she had never had before. A completely open future. For most of her life, people have tried to imagine what Angelina Jolie's daughter would eventually become. An actress, a filmmaker, a celebrity, someone connected to Hollywood. But Zahara's years at Spelman suggest that her future may be much harder to predict. She studied psychology. She built a community. She became part of Alpha Kappa Alpha. And she graduated from a college that gave her 4 years to grow away from the constant attention surrounding her family. Now that chapter is over, and the question becomes much more interesting. What does Zahara actually want to do next? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we shouldn't pretend that we do. She may continue her education. She may pursue work connected to psychology. She may become involved in advocacy or community work. She may enter a completely different creative field. Or she may choose a path that nobody expects. At 21, she doesn't need to have everything figured out. Perhaps the most important thing she gained from Spelman was the freedom to take her time. To explore. To make mistakes. To change direction. To discover what matters to her without having to announce a final answer to the world. That's something many people don't get. And for someone who grew up famous, it may be even more valuable. Because when your parents are Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, people naturally assume your future has already been writ. Hollywood, fame, movies, red carpets. But a famous family can give you opportunities. It cannot decide who you become. That part still belongs to you. And Zahara's college journey seems to have been about exactly that. She arrived at Spelman as a famous daughter. She leaves as a graduate. She arrived carrying a name the world already knew. She leaves carrying experiences that nobody else can claim. Her education, her friendships, her sisterhood, her memories, her choices, those are hers. And perhaps that is why the next chapter of Zahara's life could be more interesting than anything that came before it. Because now there is no syllabus telling her what comes next. No campus calendar. No graduation date. No predetermined role. Just a blank page. And for the first time, Zahara gets to decide what she wants to write on it. Maybe she will use her psychology degree. Maybe she will continue studying. Maybe she will work behind the scenes. Maybe she will dedicate herself to something completely outside the spotlight. We don't know, but we don't need to. Because the point of Zahara's story was never to predict her future. It was to watch her become ready to choose it. The world spent years watching Zahara grow up. Now she has finished college. She has stepped into adulthood. And perhaps the most important thing Spelman gave her was simply a degree. It was a place where she could discover who she was before deciding who she would become. She didn't have to escape her family. She didn't have to reject her parents. She didn't have to become someone completely different. She simply had to become Zahara. And now, the world gets to see what she does with that freedom.